This is Judy from Patterns for Pirates, and I'm going to sew a darling dress with you today. I'm going to be using a poly 2x2 rib, and it's got a really good back and front, right side and wrong side for you guys to see on the video. It's high stretch, and that is something that you need for the darling dress. You're going to need something with quite a bit of stretch. A high stretch knit is what I would say, and with spandex in it. You want your knit to have good recovery. What does that mean? That means once you stretch it, it pops back into place. So pick something high stretch with good recovery. Usually equates to having spandex in the fibers. This is a poly spandex. It's got 6% spandex. Looking at the percentage doesn't always give you a really good idea, but if it's got 4, 5, 6% spandex, usually it has pretty good recovery. Not always, but usually if you're ordering online. What's some of my favorite fabrics to use besides, I haven't used this. This will be a new base for me to try out. Cotton spandex will work great. Brushed polyester, double brush poly. Itty would work great. Other rib knits like Yummy Rib or a cotton rib. Let's see, stretch velvet would work nicely. Most stretch velvets, are still high stretch now. They stretch quite a bit, and they have vertical stretch. You want something that has vertical stretch, which most high stretch knits also have some vertical stretch. You want 30-40% vertical stretch, and that's because the bodice is very tight and the straps are meant to have some stretch. Also along your bust, even though it has the gathering, it's meant to have that vertical stretch when you move and you bend, or else it's going to feel restrictive and it's going to come up a little shorter than it's meant to come up. So now that we have our fabrics picked, let's get into sewing. The only thing you need besides your fabric is a little bit of elastic. I like to use cotton elastic. You can use 1/4 inch or 3/8 for almost all of it. If you're doing the short sleeve, which I am going to do the short sleeve option in this one, it needs 3/8 inch width elastic. For this little bust gather, you can use the same 3/8, or you can use 1/4 inch, which is just a little bit smaller, of course. It doesn't matter, either one. And then also, I recommend using some elastic at the waist if you are worried your fabric is going to stretch out at all. Most people prefer to have that waist nice and cinched and tight. So if you're worried about that, or if you're worried about needing to tug your dress and keep it in place, don't skip the waist elastic. It will do both those things. It'll make sure that it stays nice and tight throughout the day. It will also help keep it in place. Yeah. I prefer to have it in almost every dress. So usually I'll put it as an option, an optional thing that you can add in. The other thing we'll need is some thread, some matching thread like always. Sew it up and hem it up. But I like to also have a really high contrast thread for all the basting. There's a lot of basting in this pattern. If you're doing this short sleeve or the long sleeve, you need to gather it right here, and then the long sleeve is also gathered down here. And you also baste the bust gathering as well. And it makes it easier to remove all of the basting stitches if you use a really high contrast. I always put the high contrast color in, do all of the basting that I need to do at the beginning, then change my thread to the matching one and do the rest of the sewing.
All right, so we're starting with our basting thread in if you're using a different contrast thread, and we're gonna baste from these 2 markings on the front bodice on both the main and the lining. You want a basting stitch, which is the longest straight stitch, and you want to make sure you have both tails out the top and the bottom thread, you have quite a little tail. I'm going to start at the top and baste in a straight line right down the front center to that bottom marking. Again, give yourself nice long tails to work with. And as you can see, the contrast thread is really nice and easy to see. I do think it's helpful, definitely worth the effort. I usually do this when I'm basting and I know I'm gonna remove the threads. I like to take a pin and pin it right here at the top marking. Then I kind of wrap my thread around one side a couple times, around the other side a couple times, until I don't think that is going to get moved at all. That gives me the room that if I tug this bottom thread now, it's not just going to completely come unsewn. It's going to hold that top thread for me. You can also backstitch at the top. I think that's harder to remove though later on. So this is my preferred method. I have my little elastic piece. This is literally just basically a guide for how gathered you're going to make this little section. So I'm going to make it the same length, and then I'm going to do the same thing at the bottom. I'm going to put the pin right at the marking, and I'm going to wrap my thread a couple times around each side of my pin just to hold it in place. And you want to make sure your gatherers are kind of even. So we're going to call this one our lining, and we're just going to set it aside. And we're going to run the same basting stitch and gather this front little section on our main fabric. I'm going to do a little trick here to do the basting stitch. Whoosh. And we're going to gather it in the same way. Again, I like to throw a pin in here to hold my thread for me. And then I'm going to gather it up again just to the same length as my elastic. Trying to make sure this one is really nice and even because we're going to baste our elastic on and it will be all set. Whereas the lining piece, we won't stitch down for quite a while. I'm going to get this one nice and perfect. Before I stitch it down. And if you've watched my videos, you know I have a hard time not knocking into my camera. It's right in front of my face, in between what I'm trying to look at. So I'm still wrapping around my pins just to hold it in place for me. And then I'm going to use a basting stitch and I'm just centering my elastic right along the stitch line. I throw in another pin just to hold it for me. Make sure it's nice and centered on that bright contrasting thread. And we are just going to be basting this still. We're not going to do our final stitch. I'm sorry, I got my face in the way. It's so difficult to do things precisely with something in between you and what you're trying to do precisely. But I'm just making sure everything is all centered up. It's right on that marking, it's right on that stitch line, and it's going to get basted down right down the center. And now you can take these pins out. Should be basted in place. I don't remove any of the basting stitches yet. I leave them in and I remove them all at the end. I'm going to take our main back bodice. We're going to put them right sides together and stitch up these side seams. I am going to speed up these next couple of steps. They're really, really simple and I don't want to bore anybody. I'm going to use my serger for this. And after I do these side seams, I'm going to put my lining right sides together and stitch up those side seams as well. And you just want to be careful not to remove those pins that are holding your gathering. We're going to make sure they're perfect later on before we stitch them anyways, but it does make your life easier if they just stay in place for you. If you're doing the sleeves like me, you're going to grab your sleeve pieces and your straps. We're going to take our 2 strap pieces right sides together, our 2 of 4, and we're going to stitch down one long side. My fabric is non-directional. You can flip it upside down and you can't tell on the print. It's a tossed print. But if your fabric is directional and you want to make sure your straps are both going up and down the right way, make sure you're creating 2 mirror images here. So it doesn't matter on mine, but if they were directional, you'd want to make sure you're creating one left and one right side. And we're stitching the inner side of the strap. So the side that's going to be closest to your neck is the one that we're stitching right now. Just down one long side. Make sure you press these seams, and then you can top stitch these seams. I like to top stitch these seams. In general, I'm not a huge top stitch fanatic, but especially if you use a lining that is not the same fabric as your main fabric, you're going to want to press it really nicely and then top stitch it just to make sure your lining doesn't ever peek out. I use my cover stitch for all my top stitching in this video. I do a single thread chain stitch, but you can use whatever your favorite knit top stitch is. All right, we're gonna prep our sleeve as well. If you're doing the short sleeve like me, you're gonna press along the fold line that is marked on the pattern piece. Just like this. Give it a nice press. We're just creating a memory hem here, so we're going to press it and then we're just going to leave that alone. We're going to run a gathering stitch along this top kind of curvy part. One inside the seam allowance, I do about 1/4 inch. Make sure you have tails sticking out of the top and the bobbin. And one outside your seam allowance, which I do around 5/8 or 3/4. You really want to make sure you have one inside and one outside, or else your gathers aren't going to hold very well and they're not going to look as gathered. It's going to ease into the strap instead of being gathered to the strap. I always leave about 1 inch on each side. You're going to stitch this together, so you need at least 1/2 inch. I always leave a little bit more wiggle room than that. Because you don't want to lose any of the gathering where it attaches. So you don't want any gathering in that seam allowance. There are many other ways to gather. You can use your favorite gathering technique, of course. This just happens to be mine. And then you're going to repeat on the other sleeve as well. Okay, I pressed my straps and I did top stitch them. I didn't top stitch them on camera because my cover stitch is not in the same area. So I did top stitch that on my cover stitch machine. Now I'm going to run a basting stitch along the open side of my straps, and that's just connecting these two. It's easier to keep everything aligned and nice and flat and straight if you baste this, and it only takes a second. So I still have my contrast thread in my sewing machine, if you're wondering. We're almost done with all of our basting, so I'll be switching to the navy thread shortly. But I still have that bright yellow thread in there. I'm going to take one strap and one sleeve, but you do have to make sure that you're attaching the sleeve to the right strap. So again, the basting side is towards the shoulder and the side that is sewn nicely is towards the neck. The notch on the sleeve is to the front. So you want to make sure that this notch goes to the front of your bodice to your sleeve. So again, make sure the front is kind of pointed down if your strap is directional. So now we're just going to attach the sleeve to the strap, pin it or clip it at the bottom and the top. And then we're just going to tug on our gathering stitches until the sleeve is the same size as the strap. A little trick here is I like to tie off my top or my bottom after I tug them a little bit. That way they just don't move around. When I'm happy with them, when I think they're the same length, I just tie off both then, and then I can move the gathers around without worrying about it becoming ungathered at all. Another thing I could like to mention is I kind of prefer the sleeve to have more gathers to the center of the strap, just because it makes it a little bit more noticeable that it's kind of that poofy gathered sleeve. You don't have to do that, but I just like the way it looks. So if you can tell, I have it gathered all throughout, but it is more gathered towards the center. If you like that, you can do that. If you would rather have the gathering perfectly even, that's fine too. And you're just going to pin and clip this all along once you have the gathers all where you want it. And you can see here I am tying it off now that I'm happy with the sleeve being the same length as the strap. This is a little step that just takes 30 seconds, and it really helps get your gathers to stay, because a lot of times when you're moving your gathers around, if you try to move gathers around towards the end, they just disappear, right? Your thread gets or your fabric gets ungathered as you're trying to move it around. So if you tie off your threads there, then that will take care of that for you. I do suggest running a basting stitch on this next step. You can just go in and sew this, and if you're sewing with a sewing machine, that's fine. But if you're sewing with a serger, I really recommend basting this next step first, then taking it to your serger for your final stitch. It's something that I do not because I need to baste it to make sure that I don't mess up first, which is one reason to baste it, but I do it because it holds the gathers really nicely and neatly, whereas the serger tends to want to ease fabric in a little bit more. So I think your gathers come out prettier if you baste them on a sewing machine first, personally. So if you have trouble with your gathers, and you haven't basted them first, then I would recommend trying that. I like to stitch with my gathers facing up towards me, because the feed dogs on the bottom of the sewing machine will feed in fabric faster than the top, and you don't want to ease in your gathers. You don't want to lose your gathers. I based here with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, the same that I'm going to make my final stitch with. You could do it slightly smaller, 3/8, if you didn't want to mess with removing it. Since I'm still using that bright yellow thread, I'm not worried about removing the basting stitches. Removing basting stitches on knit fabric is so quick and easy. You just stretch your fabric, it pops the threads in a few places, and then you can pull it out. So check it here. You can even press it here first before your final stitch. And now I'm just going to run it through my serger for my final stitch at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. I do highly recommend pressing your gathers and the seam before you remove your basting stitches. You can also top stitch this seam if you would like. I usually do not top stitch this seam, but you can if you want to. Okay, so we're back from the ironing board, and now we can remove all of our basting stitches, which I'm going to speed up because I'm not teaching any new skill here. Okay, what I'm trimming right there is just where I tied my basting threads together. And this is where that high contrast bright thread really comes in handy. It makes it so much easier to remove these basting stitches when it's really easy to see. You can press this again, and then you can optionally top stitch this seam as well. I skipped it this time, just a personal preference. Okay, now we're going to take our sleeve. We're going to fold it right sides together, and we're going to stitch from kind of the armpit down to the hem. So mine's a short sleeve, so it's nice and short. But from here, the armpit, and down to the hem. I used my serger, and then you're going to repeat on the other side. I obviously need some new snips here. And then what we're going to do is we're going to repress along that memory hem that we created along that fold line on the pattern piece. It's much easier to do in the flat, so I highly recommend not skipping that memory hem, because now it's so easy to fold this up, just like that. And now we're going to edge stitch along this raw folded up side right here, and then again 1/2 inch away. We're going to leave about 1 inch unsewn on the very first step. So this edge stitch right along the raw edge, we're going to leave about 1 inch unsewn. And if you're like me and you've been using a contrast thread, now's the time where you're going to need to switch to a matching thread. I'm going to shock everyone here and use a straight stitch. I'm just going to slightly stretch my fabric while I sew my straight stitch. You can use a lightning stitch or a triple step stitch. I am not patient enough for that. This is a loose sleeve, and it's gathered with elastic, so it's probably never going to stretch. And so I'm going to use a straight stitch. When I stitch it, I'm going to stretch the fabric just slightly, as you can see, and that will give it a little stretch too. So if I do tug on it and stretch it a little bit, the threads won't pop since I gave it a little stretch. It's going to stretch as much as I stretch it, So you can see I'm just stretching it slightly. So if I stretch this as hard as I could, the threads would pop. But if I just stretch it slightly, just like I am as I'm sewing it, that's how much give these stitches are going to have. Remember, leave an inch unsewn here. And this is going to be our casing for our elastic along the bicep. And I'm just showing off the straight stitch, what it looks like on the knit, and this is how much stretch it can handle, just a little, which is fine because this is not going to need to stretch really, because it's a really loose fit and it's gathered to the arm. I'm going to use another straight stitch, and I'm going to sew 1/2 inch from the first stitch line. And we're going to sew around the entire circumference this time. We don't need to leave an inch opening like we did the first time around. This is the bottom of our casing for our little elastic piece. Again, I'm slightly stretching as I put it through, just so it has a little bit of stretch. This is going to stretch out your fabric a little bit. Just like you always hear a million times, do not stretch your knit fabric as you're sewing it, because it will stretch out and get wavy. It certainly will. And this one will as well. If you press it, it will help. But since this one is going to be gathered anyways by my elastic, you will not see any of that little waviness that it will give it. I do still recommend giving it a nice press to get rid of some of that little waviness. And now we're going to take our 3/8 inch wide cotton elastic, and we're going to feed it through this little casing that we just made. I'm going to use one of these, whatever these things are called, bodkins. I always forget. Whatever your favorite feeding tool is, you can also just use a safety pin. If you don't have any kind of feeding tool, it'll be perfectly fine. And feed it all the way through, making sure that you don't accidentally twist your elastic. I love to put a little clip right here just to make sure it doesn't get tugged all the way inside your casing. You have to leave the little tail out. It's not a super tight casing, so it should be really easy to feed through. And then once you're out the other side, what we're going to do is overlap our little tails of our elastic about 1/2 inch. And we're going to stitch them together with a wide zigzag on the machine. I like to stick a pin in there to help hold it in place as I'm putting it under my sewing machine foot. You want to make sure that you have a stretch needle for this. If you're trying to do this with any other kind of needle, even a ballpoint, it's probably not going to do very well sewing elastic. There's, you know, all that rubber in there, and a stretch needle really does the best working its way through that elastic. I do like to up the width of my zigzag. This is a pretty narrow elastic at 3/8 inch, so I just up it a few little notches. I feel like it holds it a little bit better with a little wider zigzag. And then you're just going to tug it gently to where it's all the way back into the casing. And we're going to close up this little section now. I like to just stick a pin in there, hold it in place, and help me see exactly where I need to stitch, because if you have thread that matches really well like me, it's kind of difficult to see exactly where to start and stop. And I realized I threw my pin in the wrong way, so I just switch it real quick. You're just going to use the same stitch you did for the casings, and you're just going to completely close the little 1-inch gap that we left to feed our elastic in. And if you need to try this on, somebody else to make sure the elastic is perfect for them, you can always leave that open until they try it on, so that if you need to adjust the elastic, it'll be super easy. Alright, our sleeve is done. You can just tug on this a few times to kind of redistribute the gathering around the elastic. You have a cute little ruffle puff sleeve now. And now we're going to work on attaching it to the bodice. So there's a little notch on one side of the sleeve that's going to attach to the front of the bodice. There's a single notch on the front. They're not necessarily going to line up. It's just to make sure that you attach the front to the front and the back to the back. So where we're going to line up is the armpit seams here. So the armpit seam of your sleeve and the armpit seam of your bodice. You're just going to make sure that your front notch piece is going towards the front. Then you're just going to not stretch and continue pinning or clipping to the front, and then you're going to repeat on the back. Again, there is a double notch on the back on the bodice. Those are for the straps. We do end up aligning similarly to the straps, but I actually made the sleeves come in a little bit closer than the straps. Personally, I felt like my sleeves wanted to fall off if they were as wide as the straps. You know, it was just a slight difference in wanting the straps and the sleeves. So if you wanted a wider neckline, you can always take a little bit of width on these sleeves, or the little strap pieces you can make narrower so that it's a wider neckline. We're just basting the sleeves onto the main bodice, and I basted at the full 1/2 inch, or just under is great as well. I didn't mention that it's right sides together. Hopefully you can see that it's right sides together. And then we're just going to repeat on the opposite side, exactly the same. If you remember to do 2 mirror images on everything, it should fit perfectly on the other side. Do a little magic here. And once we have both sleeves basted on, this is a good spot to try on. If you need to take the sleeves up or make them looser, this is a good spot to go ahead and slip on and make sure the strap pieces are a really good length for you. We're going to turn it so that the sleeves are down out of the way, and we're going to sew the neckline of the bodice. So again, we're just going to move our sleeves back down just how we basted them. And we're going to take our lining piece and put it right sides together to our main bodice. And we're just kind of going to ignore that the sleeves are sandwiched in there. I'm going to pin it all around. The lining and the main are exactly the same on this pattern, so no need to ease anything in. It should be really simple and easy step. You have the little notches that are actually for the straps, but they work really well to line up as well. Then you're going to line up your center little sweetheart point. I always like to use a pin here. I feel that pins are a little more precise, and also you can leave them in much longer. And you can pin or clip as much as you feel like you need for your fabric and your size. You can also only pin around the front for this step. I usually go ahead and pin around the entire thing because you're going to eventually anyways. So I just like to get it done all in one step. All right, now that we're done pinning or clipping all the way around the neckline, what we're going to do is we're going to stitch this center front sweetheart. I like to go from about notch to notch, and I like to use my sewing machine. Again, I'm going to use a straight stitch, and I'm just going to slightly stretch just a tiny bit because I like to have a really nice, precise, sharp pivot at the center front neckline. Otherwise, you're never going to get that really sharp point in your center. Now you can use a lightning bolt stitch or a triple step zigzag. I'm just not patient enough to use one of those stitches. And if you're only using this on the very front, the rest of the bodice is going to stretch plenty, and it's really not that fitted. It's not as fitted as, say, a sports bra, swimsuit, anything like that. So it does need to stretch along your upper bust, but it's not going to need to stretch the full amount of your fabric. It's going to stretch a ton along the full bust, but not here at this very top section. So I have used a straight stitch on all of mine, and that's all worked out just fine so far. Again, I just go from about notch to notch. What we're going to do is we're going to clip down the center front right in the very middle of that little V, all the way down to our stitching, but not through our stitching, right? Just opening that up. Now, this is how I like to finish off the top. You can certainly sew the rest with your sewing machine as long as you're using a stretch stitch for the rest of it. What I like to do is go over it with a serger. I do the entire thing. I leave my stitch here, so I'm not taking the full 1/2 inch seam allowance here until that stitch stops, and then I like to meet that stitch line with my serger. Take the full 1/2 inch all the way around to the other side. That way I have that really sharp point in the middle sewn by my sewing machine, and the rest of it is nice and stretchy with my serger. You can leave the front sections that you sewed with your sewing machine and just trim them, trim the seam allowance as well. That's another option. Probably want to trim them with pinking shears since it's a curve, and you want to make sure that it flips out nicely and neatly. Okay, I'm at my other side seam now, and you can watch how I meet the stitch line here. Hopefully the close-up helps a little bit. So here's my stitch line where it starts around the notch, and I'm just going to make sure that my serger meets that, and then the rest of the way I'm not worried about taking the full 1/2 inch seam allowance, because that first stitch line is already there. And just trim these off. This is lined, so I'm not worried about these unraveling. It'll be inside the lining. Make sure you give this a really good press as well. Depending on your fabric, it can kind of stretch out your fabric, getting sewn twice on that front, and the curves can get stretched out a little bit more than normal. So make sure you give this a really nice press. Now you can remove the basting stitches that were holding the sleeves to the bodice. If you don't want to remove them, at least purposely pop them so that they don't pop when you try it on. Give this a really, really nice press along this sweetheart. Make it nice and crisp and clean. Press from the inside, press from the outside, and then you can top stitch it optionally around the whole top or just along the little sweetheart section. I am not a huge top stitch person, but I do like to top stitch that sweetheart to make sure it stays nice and crisp and clean. So now we're going to finish the elastic here. All I'm doing is just making sure that my lining gathering is going to align perfectly to my elastic that is already basted down on the wrong side of the main fabric. This is a little tricky. It takes a little bit of time making sure it's nice and perfect. But since we pre-gathered it, hopefully they were held in place by our pins. And it shouldn't be too difficult. It hasn't taken me more than a minute or two on any of the ones that I've sewn up. Again, I like to wrap my thread around my pin. Basically, all I did was move my pins from the wrong side of the fabric to the right side of the fabric, just making sure that everything's aligned, and then kind of making sure my gathers are evened out along that little vertical gathering. You can stitch from this side, from the lining side, or you can stitch from the main side. I always prefer to stitch from the main side because it is the side I care most about looking perfect. I like to stitch this with a zigzag. I just do a perfectly normal zigzag. Again, I'm moving my pins one more time so that I can stitch it from the main side. And we're going to stitch through the main bodice, the elastic, and the lining. We're going to try to center our zigzag right on that basting stitch. And if, like me, you used a really bright contrast color, that's really helpful. I highly recommend using that bright contrast because it makes lining everything up so much easier when it's bright and bold and easy to see. You can line up everything perfectly and then stitch right down the middle from the top little marking to the bottom marking. And this will be our final stitch here. Now we can remove all of these basting stitches, which once again, if you used a super high contrast thread, makes it much easier. One thing that I forgot to do on this video is I do like to press this gather before I remove my basting stitches normally, and I honestly just forgot. I'm always trying to sew up very quickly for these videos so I don't have to speed too much up or cut anything out, and I simply just forgot. So I do recommend hitting it with an iron and some steam before removing your basting stitches and after removing your basting stitches as well. You can also pop them just like that if you have a few tricky pieces left inside the zigzag. It's really helpful if you just stretch your elastic and those basting stitches will all pop. There we go. Our little bust gathering is all done. I do recommend giving it one more press just to make those gathers really nice. You can go along the bottom edge and baste your lining and your main together around the waist. it'll make attaching the skirt a little easier later on. Up next, let's work on the skirt. In this video, I'm going to show how to do the slit. If you're not interested in learning how to do the slit, you can skip ahead, but here is the slit option. Here's my center panel. I'm doing the paneled front, and then I'm going to do a solid back in this video. We have the notches here on the side and the center just to make sure you're attaching the right seam to everything. That's all they are, just making sure you're putting the pieces together correctly, because they can get confusing. They all look like a little triangle shape, right? What we're going to do is pin all along, and my pin here on the center panel is marking the slit. I did the lower slit on this one, so if you're looking at your pieces thinking, oh, my slit looks like it's way higher, don't worry. Here's two slit options, a lower one and a higher one. I just happened to do the lower one on here. We're going to sew from the waist down to that marking where the slit is. You can either use a sewing machine on this entire seam, or like me, I'm just going to do it for a few inches, and I'm going to stop sharply at my marked point. And this is because you need that whole seam allowance intact to press open to hem the rest of the slit. So sometimes I sew the entire seam with my sewing machine, and sometimes I do it just like this and give it a clip into the seam allowance after a few inches. You don't want to get too close, because you want to have enough room to really press those seam allowances open near the slit. It's going to give you a nice, crisp, clean thigh slit if you do it like that. If you get it really close and your serged seam is really far close down to your slit, you're never going to get a crisp, clean point on your slit. So make sure you either sew this entire seam with a sewing machine or partially like me. And I'm just going to meet the seam allowance with my serger, and then you can see I just go off diagonally just like that. And give this a good press. And then what we're going to do is, after just pressing the seam normally, we're going to open it up. And we're going to press the remaining seam allowance open just like this. So as you can see, it really helps to have those few inches above the point to make it really nice and flat and nice and neat. Then we're going to edge stitch that just like you would any hem. I used my cover stitch, so I did not record that. But here it is, front and back. You can also use a sewing machine, of course, with whatever top stitch you like on knits. Now we have the other side of the panel. This side's even easier. You just align the waist, the notch, and the bottom hem and stitch down this whole side. And now we have the next step that's just as simple. You're going to take your back. So whether you created another paneled back, just like the front but no slit, or you're going to use a solid back like me, you're going to align the side seams and you're going to stitch from waist down to the bottom hem. Now that we have our skirt sewed up, I do recommend pressing those side seams we just stitched up. We're going to press up our hem, which is only 1/2 inch on this one. I thought it should match along the slit. I like the way that looks. So just fold up 1/2 inch and press to the wrong side. My fabric didn't hold a press super nicely, but it was still helpful, of course, and I just edge stitched that with my cover stitch, so it's all hemmed up now. Give it another press afterwards. As you can see, it's a little wobbly, so give it another press after you stitch your hem. One of the biggest things that helps your final garment look really nice and professional is pressing every seam. It might seem like it takes a lot of time and it doesn't make a big difference, but I promise it makes such a big difference in your final product. All right, now we're going to attach the skirt to the bodice. I'm just marking my center fronts and backs. I actually marked my center back already. All my pieces on the fold, I always cut a little notch. I usually cut a double notch on any back pieces and a single notch on any front pieces. So I'm just marking the center front since I did the panel and it's not on the fold. So you can see my bodice already has all of the center front and center back notches because I automatically always cut those on any piece on the fold. I know sometimes there's a push for projector pieces not to be on the fold, and I really, really don't like that. I really like to cut all my pieces on the fold. Not only do I not have to scroll around on the projector file as much, which I prefer, but I also can cut all my notches on the fold much easier if I'm cutting my pieces on the fold. So you sewists that are telling me to take all my pieces and open them up off the fold on the projectors, I hear you, but also no, I don't like that. Unless there's something I need to mark on both sides, which makes it really much easier when it's not on the fold. I highly prefer cutting everything on the fold. Also, one thing that a lot of sewists don't think about when they ask for that is that I have a really large size range, and while the very smallest pieces might fit perfectly fine off the fold, my biggest plus size pieces would not fit off the fold, and so I don't really have that option. I'm not going to change my size range, and I don't think it's fair to make it where my bigger plus sizes could never have a projection area big enough to cut their pieces nicely and easily. So for me, I like the pieces on the fold. I'm so sorry if you prefer them off the fold. Now that we're all clipped up, the waist and the bodice, the waist on the skirt and the waist on the bodice are exactly the same. So no need to stretch, no need to ease anything in. Should be a nice, easy 1-to-1 ratio. We're just going to stitch these together nice and normally, 1/2 inch seam allowance. Nothing tricky here. It is along the bias. You want to make sure you're not stretching while you stitch. It's super easy to stretch along these curves, is why I mentioned that. It's another really, really important pressing step not to skip after you stitch this waist seam. There is some negative ease at the waist. If you looked at the finish measurement chart, the waist finishes slightly smaller than the waist measurement, and that's to help make sure it feels nice and snug at the waist. Give this a really, really nice press. You can slip it on now if you would like, if you need to decide if you want the waist elastic. As you can see, my fabric grew a little bit, even though I pressed it a lot. So I'm definitely going to put my waist elastic in, and I'll show you one more time how you can tell that it grew, even though I pressed and pressed and pressed this fabric. Is it has a slight wave, if you can see. And I used my serger, so I battled this stretching out as much as I could, but it still did a little bit, as you can see. The waist elastic is the same measurement as the finished waist. So it's not smaller, but it is sturdier than most of the fabrics you're going to use since we're using high stretch fabrics. So it's going to feel snugger than if you leave it out. Just going to overlap the ends about 1/2 inch and zigzag this elastic into a little circle. I'm going to mark my elastic into even quarters. So I'm going to use the zigzag as 1. Here's another. Then put those on top of each other to find the last quarter marks. And then what I'm going to do is just stitch this to my seam allowance. I'm using 1/4 inch elastic here. So it's gonna just be the same size as my seam allowance. If all you have is 3/8, it will work too. It just won't be encased in the seam allowance if you're using a serger or wide zigzag, but it's fine. It will work too. I wouldn't use anything thicker than 3/8 though, because it's gonna start feeling a lot more snug on you. The wider the elastic, the tighter it's going to feel. So again, we aren't really wanting this elastic to make this smaller unless your fabric has stretched out, which lo and behold, see how much my fabric stretched out, y'all? So if your waist is feeling loose, you can cut the elastic and see if it's just a case of your fabric being stretched out. So no matter how much I press this, it was not going to go back in shape. My fabric just didn't have enough recovery to make it back to that original size, because we know the elastic is the same size as what the pattern should end up. And you'll have to forgive my camera abilities right here. I do turn off my knife on my serger, and then I'm gonna have to skip forward till I realized that I wasn't showing where I was sewing. Ta-da! And I realized, oh my gosh, they can't even see me sewing this. So here I am. I do have to slightly stretch my elastic just to fit my skirt. Make sure you exercise your elastic before doing this, or your elastic can also grow out on you a little bit. Exercise your elastic just means stretch it a few times before you cut it. So here's what mine looks like using a 1/4 inch elastic. It's almost all inside that serged seam allowance. And we're all done. You have your darling dress all ready to wear. I hope you love your darling dress. I hope this sew along helps too. And don't forget to share your darling dresses with us on whatever social media you have. Tag us. I'm a little bit old. I don't have all the newer ones, but I do absolutely love to see the things that you sew up and share with us on whatever social medias you like. Boop. All right, bye y'all.